One of the places where existentialism and phenomenology touch, the phenomenologists, of course, make the case that reality is best conceived of as the totality of your experience, even if that includes things that you wouldn't normally consider you. But certainly it includes things like emotions and motivations and bodily sensations and all the things that aren't precisely rational. The existentialists would take that claim and push it a bit farther by saying, and this is analogous to something I already told you, that the degree to which that phenomenological field, your field of experience, is fractured and incoherent and paradoxical, that occurs in precise proportion to the weakening of the spirit within you that necessarily has to be strong in order to remain uncorrupted by the tragic conditions of existence. So along with the existentialist claim, which is that life is unbearable in its very nature, it's tragic and unbearable in its very nature, is the idea that that's made worse by your own set of inadequacies that you could repair, and worse, that to the degree that you are rife with inadequacies that you could repair, you're going to make the tragic situation that's integral to life worse. Again, not only for yourself, but also for other people. So out of existentialism also automatically arises a kind of moral necessity, which is that you can't just sit in isolation and be useless and resentful. That doesn't work. If you're useless and resentful and you refuse to address the things that you know you should address, you can't help but pathologize everything around you. And so you're stuck with a moral duty. And the existentialists would say more than that. They would say that if you don't shoulder that existential burden, that existential moral burden, you will inevitably suffer for it. You cannot get out of it. You're stuck with it. So existentialists are great believers in free will, in that you have choice. But the free will has parameters, right? There are still things that you can't get away with. And one of them is you fundamentally can't get away with being immoral. The structure of existence is set up, well, one of the things you might say, if you were thinking about it existentially, is immoral things are precisely those things that you can't get away with. That's why people have identified them as immoral, is that they will inevitably, the consequences of enacting them will inevitably be brought to bear on you or on the people you love, or it'll snap back in some way. You know, and I see this in psychotherapy very often too. People will engage in the same kind of behavior over and over. Well, there's a classic definition of insanity, which is insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome each time. And there's an element of self-deception in that. It's like people will run out a procedure that ends in tragedy, and then they'll repeat that over and over, and you can lay out for them the causal connection between their actions and their conceptions and the outcome. And they'll listen. But there's no change whatsoever in behavior, and so then they run through the routine again, and bang! And what they're doing is immoral precisely because whenever they implement it, it produces the kind of catastrophe they claim to want to avoid. Because, you know, relativists, modern relativists like to think of morality as something that's just arbitrary, like it's a cultural construction. You know, and society 1 thinks that A is bad, and society 2 thinks that B is bad, and when you get right down to it, there's no commonality underneath all that. But the existentialists sort of undercut all that, and they just say, well, what's immoral are those things that you could change, that you do, that result in outcomes that are catastrophic for you. That's it. That's what immoral is. And so that's universal, because it doesn't really matter what the details are. You know, like what you do that's immoral could be very much different than what you do. It might be temperamental. You know, we're each in our own playing field in a sense. But there's a commonality underneath that, which is, well, for example, you won't get away with deceiving yourself. You just can't. And the reason you can't is because you need a model of the world that's like the world. And if you try to live in a model of the world that isn't like the world, you'll just bump into the world. And so the deception brings with it its own punishment, and that's why it's immoral.